Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
About 7 years ago, I got involved with someone who still makes me question what kind of people are out there. I'd just come out of an 8-year relationship, and it hit me a lot harder than I expected. Even though we both agreed it wasn't working anymore and ending it was probably the right decision, losing someone who had been part of my everyday life for so long left me feeling completely lost. I didn't really know who I was without that relationship, and it took me a while to even start feeling like myself again. Around that time, I signed up for a dating app. It doesn't really matter which one. I went on a handful of dates with different women, and for the most part, they were all nice people. We got along well enough, but after talking for a while, it usually became obvious that we wanted very different things out of life. I had some enjoyable evenings, but none of those first dates ever turned into a second one. Then I met Polly. There was something about her that immediately pulled me in, and even now I struggle to explain what it was. Looking back, I think part of it was how mysterious she seemed. These days, that's one of the biggest red flags I can think of. I'm not saying I expect someone to tell me their entire life story the first time we meet, because that would be weird. But when someone goes out of their way to hide basic things about themselves, it immediately puts me on edge. That's something I only learned after everything that happened. At the time, though, I thought she was just private. We both lived in West Virginia, and she picked the restaurant for our first date. I actually encouraged her to choose because I know a lot of women feel more comfortable meeting somewhere familiar, somewhere they know they can ask for help if something ever feels off. That made complete sense to me. I still remember the drive there, winding through those quiet Appalachian back roads with almost no traffic around, feeling more nervous than I'd been in years. By the time dinner was over, though, I drove home feeling excited. It had been a long time since I'd met someone who seemed that interesting. After that first date, we spent about a week just texting, because she told me work had gotten really busy. Even though we both lived in West Virginia, we weren't exactly close to each other. So we kept talking every day while trying to figure out when we could meet again. I mention all of this because it's important to understand how things developed before they started getting strange. For the next couple of months, we saw each other pretty regularly. During that time, I kept trying to learn more about her, asking about her family, her friends, where she grew up, the usual things people ask when they're getting to know someone. The problem was that every conversation somehow circled away from her. I never met a single member of her family. I never saw her house. I never met any of her friends. Once she felt comfortable around me, every date happened at my place, with my friends, or somewhere connected to my life. At first, I actually felt guilty for wanting to know more about her, like I was being too pushy. I convinced myself she probably had some difficult family history or something personal she wasn't ready to talk about yet. So, I decided to give her time and let her open up whenever she felt comfortable. Weeks turned into months, but nothing ever changed. One thing she talked about constantly was camping. Even though she'd lived around these mountains her whole life, she claimed she'd never gone hiking or camping before. She seemed fascinated by it. She'd asked to see my gear, wanted me to explain what different pieces of equipment were for, and kept bringing up the idea of us spending a weekend out in the mountains together. I'd camped plenty of times before, so eventually I told her we'd go, if she really wanted to. The very first thing she asked was whether she could choose the exact place where we'd camp. That caught me a little off guard, because she'd never done anything like this before. I couldn't understand how she already had a specific location in mind. She never really explained it. She just said she'd figure something out. I laughed it off and figured it didn't really matter, because I'd scout the area beforehand anyway. That's something I always do. I checked the terrain, nearby campsites, possible hazards, water sources, everything. People who spend enough time in West Virginia usually learn how to prepare before heading into the mountains. Looking back, I walked straight into what she had planned without questioning it nearly enough. The day we finally started hiking, she was more excited than I'd ever seen her. At first, I thought it was nice. I figured she was happy to be trying something new with me, and seeing her that excited honestly put me in a great mood too. But after we'd been hiking for a while, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. She kept asking detailed questions about my gear, not in the way someone who's curious normally would, but almost like she was taking inventory of everything I had with me. She seemed especially interested in my satellite phone, since there wouldn't be any cell service where we were going. Then she started asking questions about my handgun. That immediately made me uncomfortable. I'd already told her from the beginning that I never let other people handle it. It wasn't about trust. It was simply something I took very seriously, and I preferred being the only person responsible for it. She didn't like that at all. I could tell it bothered her, and I remember thinking she probably felt like I didn't trust her yet. I tried explaining that it wasn't personal, but after that I couldn't shake the feeling that she was paying a little too much attention to the things I had brought with us. By the end of our first day, we'd reached the area she'd picked. It actually wasn't a bad campsite. It was just farther from everything than I would have chosen myself. We spent the evening like any other camping trip, cooked dinner, talked for a while, and eventually went to sleep. The next morning I realized my satellite phone was gone. What caught my attention even more than the missing phone was the way Polly reacted. She immediately launched into this huge panic, insisting someone must have broken into the tent while we were asleep, stolen it, and disappeared without us noticing. The problem was that none of that made any sense. Before going to bed, after she'd already fallen asleep, I'd locked the tent zipper from the inside with a small padlock, something I always do when camping in remote areas. The zipper had never been opened. There were no cuts in the fabric, no damaged seams, no signs that anyone had forced their way inside. When I pointed that out and explained that getting into the tent without waking us would have been impossible, I watched her expression change. It wasn't fear anymore. She looked frustrated, almost irritated that I'd shut down her explanation so quickly. At that point, I asked to look through her backpack. She completely lost it. She exploded at me for even suggesting she had anything to do with it, acting in a way I'd never seen before, and I'll admit, it caught me completely off guard. I backed away, told her we were leaving immediately, and started packing my gear. By then, I was convinced she'd taken the satellite phone herself. There simply wasn't another explanation. Nobody else had been inside that tent. She was the only other person there. That's when she told me she didn't care if I left, because she was staying. Even after everything that had happened, I still couldn't bring myself to leave her alone in the middle of those mountains. I tried to reason with her one last time. I told her the woods weren't the kind of place to play games, that I understood she was upset, even if I couldn't understand why, and that I didn't care who was right anymore. I just wanted both of us out of there before something bad happened. I explained that there were predators out there, that those mountains could turn dangerous fast if you didn't know what you were doing, and that if she came back with me, she'd never have to see or talk to me again. I wasn't trying to save the relationship. I was trying to get us both out of a dangerous situation alive. She was furious, way beyond what made any sense. It wasn't normal anger anymore. She refused to leave, told me she was staying no matter what, and insisted that if I was leaving, I should leave most of my gear behind so she'd at least have what she needed to sleep comfortably. At that point, I'd run out of ways to convince her. I figured we were both adults. If she wanted to stay, that was her choice. I knew I was only about a day's hike from my truck, and if I kept moving that night, I could probably make it back. All I wanted was to get away from whatever this had turned into. Before I left, though, she demanded that I hand over my gun. That was the one thing I wasn't even willing to consider. I told her it wasn't happening. If she wanted to hike out with me, she was welcome to come, but if she insisted on staying, she'd have to make do with the supplies I was already leaving behind. I wasn't giving her my firearm under any circumstances. She completely lost it after that. She was practically screaming at me, acting in a way that honestly scared me more than anything that had happened up to that point. I started wondering if she might actually try to hurt me herself, so I stopped arguing. I picked up my pack, turned around, and started following the trail back toward where I knew my truck was parked. I couldn't have been more than 30 minutes away when I climbed onto a rocky overlook to catch my breath. From there, I had a clear view of the area we'd camped in, and I noticed what looked like our tent off to my right. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw 3 men walking toward her. My stomach tightened immediately. Those mountains attract all kinds of people, and not all of them are there for good reasons, so my first thought was that she was about to get herself into trouble. Then I watched her greet them. She walked right up to them and hugged them. I pulled out my binoculars to get a better look, and that's when everything clicked into place. All 3 of them were armed. They looked rough, like they spent a lot of time out there, and the 4 of them immediately started talking in a way that looked frantic. I couldn't hear the conversation from where I was, but I didn't need to. Every instinct I had told me they were talking about me. Whatever this trip had been, it hadn't been spontaneous. It had been planned. I didn't waste another second trying to figure it out. I slipped back behind the rocks, left the trail she knew I'd take, and cut across to a creek I remembered seeing on my map. Once I reached the water, I started following it upstream as fast as I could. I wanted to leave as little of a trail behind as possible. I ran until my legs felt like they were going to give out, putting as much distance between me and that campsite as I could. When night finally caught up with me, I found a spot where I could shelter with solid cover and a clear view of anyone approaching. If somebody came looking for me, I'd see them before they saw me. As you can probably imagine, I didn't sleep for even a minute. I just sat there with my gun in my hands, listening to every sound in the woods until the sun finally came up. The second it was light enough to move safely, I got back on my feet and kept hiking until I reached my truck. I threw my gear inside, started the engine, and got out of there as fast as I could. For a while afterward, I was nervous because she knew where I lived. I'd brought her to my place plenty of times. The only thing that gave me some peace of mind was that I shared the house with 2 other guys, and none of us were exactly small. If she or those men ever decided to show up, they wouldn't be dealing with just one person. Luckily, the timing worked in my favor. The 3 of us were already in the process of moving because our landlord had raised the rent and we weren't willing to pay it. She knew I was leaving that house, but she never found out where I moved. That was 7 years ago. I've never seen her again, never heard from her again, and I've spent a lot of time wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed. I'm convinced the whole thing was a setup from the very beginning. I don't know exactly what they planned to do, or why she lied about never having been in those mountains before, when those guys walked straight to her like they'd done it 100 times. I know she took my satellite phone. I'm almost certain the next step would have been getting my gun away from me too. The only reason she never did was because I always slept with it against my body, and she probably realized she couldn't take it without waking me up. I don't know what would have happened to me if I'd stayed there 1 more hour, but I'm convinced it would have been something very, very bad. What I'm about to tell you happened about a year ago in the Appalachian Mountains. The worst part of it didn't actually happen to me, though. It happened to someone I was lucky enough to help, and looking back, I think we both came within minutes of something much worse. I've replayed that night in my head more times than I can count, wondering how differently it could have ended if I'd made even one different decision. I've always been into hiking and camping. For years, my favorite place was the Pacific Crest Trail. But then the Appalachians started getting a lot more attention online. People couldn't seem to agree on whether they were beautiful or terrifying, and that only made me more curious. I started exploring different sections whenever I had time, and I fell in love with the place after my very first trip. I still go back every year. What happened that night didn't scare me away from those mountains, but it definitely changed how I camp. I'm a lot more cautious now, and I pay attention to things I probably would have ignored before. It happened on the very first night of that trip. I was camping in a part of West Virginia where almost nobody goes anymore. There's an old dirt road that still leads into the area, but it's in terrible shape, and most vehicles wouldn't even make it through. One section farther up had even been closed off years earlier because it was considered unsafe. So the whole place stays incredibly quiet. I'd camped there twice before without a single problem. By the time I finished setting everything up, it was already dark. I had my Jeep parked where I wanted it. Both tents were up, and dinner was cooking over my stove. I've had a habit for years of setting up what I call a decoy tent. One tent sits out in the open with some gear and supplies inside, while the one I actually sleep in is tucked away somewhere harder to spot. It's something I started doing after a few uncomfortable encounters with weird people over the years. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to convince me that having a backup plan isn't a bad idea. While I was eating, I happened to look across the valley toward the ridge on the opposite side. That's when I noticed a flashlight moving around. At first, I didn't think much of it. People hike at odd hours sometimes, and I figured somebody was making their way to a campsite. But I kept watching for a few minutes because something about the way the light moved felt off. Then another light appeared much farther down the mountain. When I say farther, I mean they were nowhere near each other. It definitely wasn't two people hiking together. As I watched, a pattern became obvious. The first light was steadily moving toward the second one. The second light kept turning on and off, over and over again, while continuing to move away. It looked less like someone hiking and more like someone trying to see where they were going without making themselves too easy to track. That was the first moment I started thinking I might be watching someone chase another person through the woods. Situations like that always put me in a difficult spot. Part of me wants to mind my own business, especially when I'm alone in the middle of nowhere. The other part can't just ignore something that looks wrong. I'd run into enough strange situations over the years to know that people can be every bit as dangerous as the wildlife out there. I kept watching, hoping I'd realize there was a harmless explanation for what I was seeing. Then the two lights got much closer together, and I heard a scream echo across the valley. It was unmistakably a woman's voice, and it wasn't the kind of scream you mistake for someone joking around. It was the sound of somebody desperately trying to get anyone nearby to realize they were in serious trouble. I figured I was at least 40 minutes away on foot, so I made a split-second decision. I grabbed my handgun, threw a few essentials into my Jeep, started the engine, and headed down the dirt road toward where I'd seen the lights. At first I drove with my headlights on, moving as fast as the road would let me, which honestly wasn't very fast because the trail was rough enough to shake the whole vehicle apart. Once I got close to where I thought everything had happened, I switched the headlights off and crept forward as quietly as I could. Eventually, I stopped completely, shut the engine off, cracked the driver's door open, and just listened. For several minutes, I didn't hear anything except the woods around me. Then I picked up the faint sound of someone crying. It was quiet, almost impossible to hear, but it was close enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. I quietly closed the door, started walking toward the sound, and within maybe 5 minutes I saw them. A man was standing over someone lying on the ground, hitting them over and over again. Seeing something like that flipped a switch in me. I've never been able to stand by and watch somebody get hurt without doing something. I yelled as loud as I could to get his attention, raised my handgun, and fired. I'd been shooting for years, mostly clay targets, and I knew exactly where I wanted that shot to land. I hit his hand hard enough to make him stop what he was doing without risking the woman on the ground. Everything after that happened so fast, it's still hard to remember every detail. The woman started screaming, completely terrified because she had no idea what had just happened. The man yelled too, spun around toward me, and for the first time, I got a decent look at him. Even in the dark, I could tell he was a large, white man with a beard. Before I could react again, he turned and disappeared into the trees at a full sprint. For a couple of seconds, I seriously considered chasing him. I knew he'd been hit, and I figured he couldn't have gotten very far. But the woman needed help a lot more than I needed to catch him. I ran over to her, helped her to her feet, and got her back to my Jeep. She was in terrible shape. I won't go into detail because nobody needs that picture in their head, but it was obvious she'd been through something horrific. I gave her some water, found a little food she could manage, and waited until she was calm enough to tell me what had happened. She looked young, probably in her early 20s, and she could barely get the words out. Between sobs, she explained that she'd been hiking with a friend when they'd crossed paths with that man. Her friend had managed to escape, but she'd been caught. She'd gotten away once after that, but he'd tracked her down again, and she'd been trying to stay alive in those mountains for almost 3 days. I didn't waste another second and drove straight to the nearest hospital. I stayed at the hospital long enough for the police to arrive so I could give my statement. Once they got there, I could see she was in good hands, both with the hospital staff and with the officers handling the case. From what they told me, this wasn't the first report they'd received about someone stalking people in that particular area. Apparently, there had already been an investigation going on for a while, but they still hadn't found anything concrete. They told me that if the case moved forward, they'd get back in touch and ask me to see if I could identify the man. I explained that I probably wouldn't be much help. I never got a clear look at his face. All I could tell them was that he was a tall white man with a beard and a fairly large build. Beyond that, it had simply been too dark for me to make out any real details. The young woman, though, despite everything she'd been through, struck me as incredibly resilient. She seemed much more likely to be able to give them a detailed description of the man who'd been chasing her. She thanked me over and over again, even though I didn't feel like I'd done anything that deserved thanking. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and I did what I hope anyone else would have done. After about 3 hours of answering questions, giving my statement, and leaving all of my contact information, I finally headed home. I never heard another word about the case. I never found out what happened to her, or whether her friend was ever found. The police never called me back, and I never received any kind of update. I still think about both of them every now and then, and I hope they're both alive, safe, and doing well. I've had my share of strange experiences over the years, especially out in the mountains, but this one has stayed with me more than any of the others. It wasn't because I fired my gun, or because I came face to face with someone capable of doing something so violent. It was because of the condition that young woman was in when I found her, and because I still can't shake the feeling that if I'd looked away from those lights across the valley, or convinced myself it was none of my business, she probably wouldn't be here today.